Okay, so now we're going to talk about content-enriched shared book reading. Content-enriched shared book reading is really different from just your typical practice. Content-enriched shared book reading is shared book reading that focuses on a subject area. Usually, it's science or social studies. There are very few studies out there conducted with English language learners in which ELLs are focusing on science and social studies concepts in a book discussion. The big question that comes up with children whose language, second language, is still emerging is the ability and the need to scaffold to help children to be able to participate if it's teaching English as a second language. There's a video that I'm going to look for during lunchtime that I always show. It's a pre-K school children, the teacher, and they're focusing on a science discussion and what she does to scaffold them into the discussion because they're all very engaged and very active. So we're now going to focus on shared book reading, where the focus is on science and social studies. Okay. This is a publication that I would recommend that you look at. You can subscribe to it. It's put out by the American, AFT, American Federation of Teachers, the union. It's called The American Educator. The articles are always so very relevant. You can also find them online. This is an important issue. The issues are always theme-based. And this was an issue that was published around the importance of building background knowledge in society. Why? Because background knowledge provides a foundation for understanding what you read. Reading a newspaper, reading a book, whatever it is that we read, we're bringing knowledge to the experience to help us to understand it. And what this article specifically focuses on is the knowledge around social studies and the knowledge around science. So here's some example at the pre-K kindergarten level of what knowledge is important for children to engage in, to be ready to understand text when they are learning how to read. So for example, social studies, the community, geography, economics, science, the natural world, living things, life cycles, and change. And I saw some of these themes or standards in some of your shared book reading lessons. In content-enriched shared book reading, we want to really think about how we put all the content together within a 20-minute lesson. And so you've seen these design principles multiple times. You've had multiple exposures to these design principles, where when you're designing a shared book reading lesson, you start with what are the big ideas that you want to teach about science or about social studies? What kind of strategies do I explicitly want to use? We just looked at a whole list of them. What kind of scaffolding can I provide? Will I use visuals to scaffold? Are there other ways that I can scaffold? How will I make connection between new information that children learn with what they were previously taught? You explicitly do that. What ways can I review at the end of the lesson, at the end of the week, at the end of the month, so that they continue to revisit those topics and words? How do I build background knowledge? You've seen various ways that you did this in your practice, using visuals, having a conversation before reading the book, and then providing intentional opportunities for language interaction. So that's, looking at the dialogues that we try to develop. So here's an example, because we're going to talk about designing a lesson. Here's an example of where I start when I'm designing a shared book reading lesson. This is a lesson or unit of lessons around science and social studies. So I first looked at those big ideas around language, science, and social studies that come from national guidelines. And you see them here. So for example, I've got a study about the human body, about animals, about plants, about the physical environment. Then I think about, are these big ideas, how do they look at this grade level? This, for example, is pre-K. So for me, starting with the visual helps me to organize my instructional unit because this is my map for creating my instruction. I can't overemphasize the importance of building background knowledge. How many of you, just a show of hands, just to be really honest, in your shared book reading, you didn't take the time or didn't think about building background knowledge? For how many of you was it missing?
I think I did it, but I think it could have been more in depth.
It could have been more in depth.
We've been working on inferencing before, so I said, remember, inferencing is when you take what you know plus what you read in the text to make your inference, and then just went on. So made him think about it, but again, I could have spent more time.
What was your text about?
My text was, don't let pigeon drive the bus.
Okay.
And so,
what background knowledge could you have provided around that topic about driving a bus?
Do you let little kids drive the bus? Is it for adults only? Those sorts of things.
Why would it be for adults? There you go.
So, like I said, I did it, but it could have been more in depth.
Could have been more in depth. Okay, great. So this is something that you want to keep in the front of your planning. Always taking the time to build background knowledge. And we're going to skip this, so I need to get to this. So, if you were developing a topic immersion shared book reading approach, topic immersion is what that article recommended for developing instruction for children. With a topic immersion approach, you're going to focus on a theme, a science theme, social studies themes. So if you think about what you teach at your grade level, and you're going to design some shared book reading, 15, 20 minutes a day, to complement your teaching so that you have some time to go deep in a concept that you're focusing on. I want you to think of how would you distribute that from September through April, because I know you have testing months and then you have beginning of school where you're trying to just get started, and so this may not be feasible. What does the end of the year look like, April?
The earth. For kindergarten, it's the earth.
Okay.
Recycling, talking about taking care of planet Earth is what we usually end with.
Okay. So keep this in mind, because we're going to come back to this and we're going to look at the appendices to help you, because that's not something you can do today. But I'm just trying to set you up for how you can use some of the techniques I'm going to teach you to set up a year-long shared book reading approach, because you are able to, just 15, 20 minutes a day, incorporate a lot of talk and learning around a science or social studies theme with interesting books. And the techniques that we look at use twin books or thematic text sets. So I've given you a thematic text set. A thematic text set is when you have a storybook and it's paired with an informational text. And so you do repeated readings with both of those texts. And so multiple exposures, because you're focusing on the same thing, is across the book and across the text sets, okay? So let's look at now preschool and kindergarten, what shared book reading might look like using a topic immersion approach. We know that preschool is really important in terms of language development, and that's what's really interesting or frightening is that preschool language experiences are very predictive of fourth grade academic outcomes. So the preschool years in terms of language development are very important. So the first project I'm going to refer to is called Project Words of Oral Reading and Language Development. So in our approach, we developed this shared book reading intervention in collaboration with preschool teachers who are in mainstream settings, and they were also in bilingual settings. And so our goal was to accelerate preschool language development by focusing on content-related words that are being taken from storybooks and informational texts that are paired by a theme. Well, that's it. Our framework was this topic immersion approach so that we can allow teachers to accelerate time, accelerate how they use their instructional time. That has been the whole purpose of all of my work, is to help teachers to look at a little bit of time and how you can get the most out of that time. So with shared book reading, how can you get the most out of 15 or a 20-minute discussion? Okay, so this is the visual. I have to have a visual. This is my visual that helps me to develop my shared book reading. I start with my guidelines here. Can I move this? Yeah, move it up here. I start with my science and social studies and language development guidelines. My themes, nature, living things. I choose smaller topics because I'm going to take 1 week to focus on a small topic. So 1 week, what can water do? Next week, what can light do? Another week, what can air do? Another week, what are the seasons? You know, what is the role? It was really a focus on change, the concept of change. I have twin sets of books, narratives and informational text. You can't see what my concepts are, but what's really unique about this approach is the way I select my vocabulary. I select vocabulary that are semantically related. So for example, when focusing on what can water do, my words across my text sets were liquid, frozen, snow, and then in another theme, which was on living things, it was about plants, garden, plant, and leaf. So I select words that are related to each other. Why do you think that helps young children learn abstract science and social studies concepts? Why would that be important? What do you think?
There's more connection, so it's more coherent for them.
There is coherent because there's a connection. Who can add to that?
It's repeated. They're going to hear them in multiple texts. They're going to have multiple exposures to them.
They
They're gonna
will
see
have
them
multiple
in-
exposures to them, but they could have multiple exposures if I just selected words that weren't connected. What you want to do in your work is you want to develop networks of knowledge. I'm going to say that again. What you want to do in your work is to develop networks of knowledge. Let's talk about what is a network. If I were doing a quick brainstorm on the concept of baseball, the sport of playing baseball, what are some words that you would associate with the word or the sport baseball? Very quickly, what do you associate with baseball?
Field, bat,
Sandy. Field, bat, gloves,
run,
run,
Teams.
team, coach,
dugout,
dugout,
base,
base, strike,
fly ball,
home run, pitcher. I gotta be fast. These words are all connected to the concept of playing this sport, okay? So when I teach baseball, I'm really teaching all of this information. And as I teach other sports, because other sports require running, like what? Football. What else?
Basketball, soccer, basketball.
Basketball, soccer.
Cross.
What I'm doing is creating schema, places within the brain so that children can make connections between the new information with what has already been taught. Creating networks of knowledge accelerates learning and helps children to easier recall concepts, as opposed to my teaching these words in isolation. Children begin to see connections between words. So this is a book reading structure in which I'm going to be very strategic in a selection of my vocabulary words. Think about the words that you taught in the shared book reading that you uploaded. How did you select the words? Quickly, who can tell us, how did you select the words?
Mine was our theme. The overall theme was community, but making the connection between neighborhood, because they knew what their neighborhood was.
Yours were semantically connected. I saw that. Okay, other people, how do you select vocabulary words that you teach from the book?
Mine were highlighted in the nonfiction book and then related in the literary book.
So they were already selected for you?
Yeah.
They were already selected for you, so it's just from the curriculum itself. Can you teach other words? Okay. What about people in the north? How did you select your words?
A lot of the time, like words that I think maybe they don't know or they don't have enough background knowledge to understand, like maybe like here, a lot of my kids don't understand city, like because we're a small town, you know, so things like that.
Okay. Melinda, how did you select your words?
Well, because we're talking about animals that live in the desert, so we had to talk about the different places to make it relevant to the desert being different than the jungle, and then the animals that live there.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how do you select words, how do you select books, but in Project World, we want everything to be connected. We want the text sets to be connected to the theme. We want the words to be connected to the theme. We want the science and the social studies concepts to be connected to the theme, because we're building broad networks of knowledge. What we found in our study when we followed these children from pre-K to K to first grade, we followed them to second grade, they retain the knowledge. They don't forget. Questions? Heard someone say something.
Oh, I was just saying, I think of math terms. We started using like a standard math vocabulary.
Yeah.
And my kids were like, I know this word, we learned it last year.
Good, they're making a connection.
The connection.
Right, okay. So here's an example of our 5-day scope and sequence. You've probably seen this in the curriculum development class. I have found 5 days to be sufficient to go in depth on a topic related to a theme. So here we're looking at 2 books, Owl Babies and a Nest Full of Eggs. Owl Babies, that's a storybook. Nest Full of Eggs, that was informational text. We read Owl books twice. We read A Nest Full of Eggs twice. And then on day 5, we made some connections across the books. We distributed instruction before we read, while we were reading, and after we're reading. Look at the number of words that we taught. Pre-K and K, it's appropriate. 3 words per text, 6 words per book. Second grade, I'll talk about the quantity of words. Second and third grade, the quantity of words that are appropriate to teach. This took teachers, because we developed this with teachers, 20 minutes. Okay, so that's how we were able to maximize time within a 20-minute approach. Okay, so you notice that we use lots of visuals. We use posters as visuals, like a collage. Like here, we wanted to teach about living things. So we had many different kinds of living things, so that at the beginning of the week, day 1, the teacher had a discussion about what are living things. Living things require water. I can't remember, it's a little phrase that they would use. But we use visuals in the form of thematic posters to build background knowledge before they even read the text. Vocabulary selection. The words were all visually represented in the book, and the words were all semantically related to create knowledge networks. Here's an example from a science book. We're teaching the word hatch. We wanted to make sure there was a really good picture here so the child would not be confused about what hatch means. These visuals were really important because when it came time to teach abstract concepts like change, we could only teach change when we were talking about the seasons so that they could see evidence of change. Here's an example of, here's a social studies unit, earth, land and water, living things, they eat, they grow, and they use air. That was the little definition that they learned. So for earth, we had 3 weeks, week 10, 11, and 12. Week 10, here's the storybook, here's the informational text. Week 11, here's the storybook, here's the informational text. How many words do we teach per book?
3.
Right, so for pre-K and kindergarten, it's appropriate 3 words per text, 6 words a week. That's feasible, that's what the children learned. And then we gave them really child-friendly definitions so that they could remember. But we didn't give them, the definition was given in the reading process. Okay, let's see what else I want to share with you here. Here's how we selected the books. First, you tell me how you select your books. How do you select the books that you're going to use for, besides them being part of a curriculum, when you want to read a book to a child that's not part of the curriculum, how do you go about, because you have books that you selected to bring here. How did you go about selecting the books?
It's connected to the topic. It's
Connected to a big
concept.
Good, a concept that you want to teach, a theme, a topic that you want to teach. What other criteria do you use for selecting a book? Because think about the children that you were teaching, their language level, your grade level. What's the criteria? Yeah.
It needs to have a content-rich vocabulary. So if you're working on, you know, the earth, you need to look for books that have exposure to the words meadow, shore, pond. You don't want to just pick an earth book if it doesn't hit those words, those vocabulary words that maybe are your network of knowledge to build into it.
Thank you. And you know what we actually did? We started with the book first and got the words from there. Because we spent a whole year, we have the luxury of doing that, a whole year just reading children's books, going to libraries, and librarians would pull books, and teachers would pull their favorite books. And we just read books. And we looked for words that would be important for teaching the theme and the smaller concept. And you know what? There are a lot of books you can't use. There are a lot of books you can't use because they don't allow a rich discussion. There aren't any rich concepts. There aren't any rich vocabulary to teach. Okay, that was really difficult. Or it might have been too difficult. The words might have been too difficult, or the concepts too abstract. So this was our planning structure. We selected the text first, based upon the kind of books that we, kind of vocabulary that we could find there. So here's our book selection criteria. We wanted a text that is 1 grade level above the student's grade. Why? So for pre-K, they were kindergarten texts. When I was working with kindergarten students, those are 1st grade texts. For interventions for 2nd grade children, those are 3rd grade texts. Why? Think of what I'm trying to do in terms of the concept of acceleration and maximizing time. Why do I only select books that are 1 grade above and not on grade level?
Because you want it to be a little difficult, but not like crazy difficult.
Going to be challenging. Okay, what else?
Most kids' listening comprehension is a level higher than their reading comprehension.
Okay, so their comprehension level is a little bit different. What else? What else?
You want it to be, you want to bring them up in their knowledge, so if you're just at your grade level, then you're not expanding the
Well,
language.
I could be for pre-K. I've got lots of things I could, be teaching at that level.
Close the gap.
But this is their instructional level. You're the teacher, you're reading it, and that's how they're accessing that information. So it doesn't have to be on grade level.
It does not, because they're listening. But here's the thing about it. If I'm preparing children, if I need to accelerate their learning, okay, especially with language learners, because I know it doesn't matter that it takes 5 years to develop an academic language that can support learning. I know that in my school and in my school district, children have to be reading and learning and be ready for the next grade. So if I want them to be ready for the next grade, I'm going to start exposing them to concepts now, okay? I'm going to start building a foundation for deeper comprehension now. I'm not waiting until next year. And I can do this because this is all done orally, okay? Even in first grade and second grade, I'm not asking them to read share book reading because I'm reading, the adult is reading the text to the child. So I can use a text that's 1 grade above. I also look for the content and language that is age appropriate. It's not excessively long in terms of numbers of pages. It does not have an excessive amount of new vocabulary. I always get questions from teachers around these kinds of books. So some books, let's say on transportation, you see pages of transportation, pages of cars, pages of trucks, pages of different kinds of planes. You can't teach all of that. It becomes very distracting for young children. So I try to get rid of some of the distractors so I can focus on what the key concepts are. I also don't want any irrelevant details. What I want are concepts that are visually represented, content that can be read and discussed in 20 minutes, and a sufficient number of words that are tied to the theme. Pre-K, kindergarten, 3 words. 3 words that are tied to a theme. For storybooks, I look for structure because we're going to talk about a story problem and we're going to talk about characters. I look for stories that are sequential. You'll be surprised. Some books are not sequential. And for young learners, it's really hard to figure out the sequence of something. I look for illustrations that clarify. I think do you have a nest full of eggs? Yeah. So take a look at a nest full of eggs. Teachers in the north, did you bring the books that were sent? Yeah. So look at a nest for eggs. If I'm going to talk about life cycles and change, I need to have examples. Let's see, is it in this one? Somewhere in here. Yeah, where they're looking like on page 11, like the parts of the egg. I make sure that all the information, that the diagrams are easy to follow, that it's not confusing, okay? I look to make sure that the facts are up to date, that if there are cycles, that the cycles are represented chronologically. I don't have time for confusion. And children can be confused in book reading when visuals misrepresent something. So I have to check everything. Okay? So this is what we use for book selection criteria. Are there any criteria here that perhaps you use now? Are you doing any of this now? If you're not, that's fine.
We may not intentionally.
May not intentionally.
May not have explicitly thought of it, but the text
This way.
structure allows learning more facts about
Right.
the topic, but we're choosing books about our topic to
Right.
help them learn more.
So here are some tips for you to explicitly think about when you're teaching text. There's an article I think I put in the binder for you. I'm not going to go over it, but it was by Sugar, who studies errors that children make in shared book reading. So for example, she talks in one of her articles about a book where there's a shadow, and then the shadow is doing something on another page in a different way, and how confusing that is for children. So she has conversations around that because children, 4-year-olds in this case, 5-year-olds, may not make that connection. And so sometimes the visuals take them down the wrong path. And so you have to be aware of that. Any questions, comments? Okay, so I was looking at this. Here we go. Here's some other examples. This was from a different text.
It's in the
No,
slide.
Is it, that's what I was looking for. I couldn't find it, okay?
It was the very next page.
So we include questions at the lower cognitive level. What is this? Who remembers what? Recalling, identifying, labeling. But on day 2, we're here. This is the same as Bloom's taxonomy. Here, we're asking children, what's the same? What's different? And why? And to scaffold, what do you think the teacher uses?
The book, visuals.
The visuals in the book and the visual cards. So they can be used in multiple ways. So here's an example of a high cognitive task. These tasks only appear on day 2 because I'm going to have you practice to write some of these. So we're focusing on what water can do. Water can melt. So they learn melted and frozen. So we asked the children, what's the difference between melted water and frozen water? We give a talking prompt, but the teacher is the one who has to get the children to be able to talk about it. So melted water is wet, frozen water is hard and cold. That's the difference. Would something that has melted feel wet? Why or why not? Yes, because something has to get warm to melt into a liquid. So liquid feels wet. And there's always a big kid question to see if you can figure it out. Could you find melted ice cream in a refrigerator? Why or why not? We had some really some interesting examples in week 1 where we talked about a city. And one of the questions was, can you find, I think it was like cows in a city? And one child said, yeah. And so the teacher said, well, where? How can you find cows in a city? Because usually, and she's elaborating, usually cows require large fields of grass. And so that would be out like on a farm or in a rural area. The child says, you can find cows at the zoo, in the petting zoo. So then that brought another discussion about why do we have petting zoos? Because we're taking children to expose them to things that they can't normally find in a city. So that was a really smart way of expanding that child's knowledge because they were right. You can't find cows in a city, okay? So these are examples of challenging questions. So I want you to think about your practice in terms of when and how can you introduce these types of questions. You received a book by Beck and McKeon called Bringing Words to Life. This is all from Beck and McKeon's work. Beck and McKeon's work helps teachers to get at a higher cognitive level in their shared book reading and literacy, vocabulary instruction. You all have that book, right? You should have.
I think I know I have it. I don't have
You
it.
should have received this September session with
Sure.
Dr.
I know I
Carter
have a
Hagen.
copy, I just don't
Okay,
have it.
yes, you got it. Well, that's why we gave it to you, because there's lots of activities like this that you can design and create.
Yeah.
So this is what a day 1 lesson would look like. We start with lower cognitive tasks, okay? So we preview the words first through visuals. Teacher might say, look at this picture. This is a branch pointing. A branch is the small part of the tree that comes out from the trunk. You saw the teacher use lots of gestures, okay? So what are some ways that you can use a branch? Connecting it to life, school to world. I can play with it. I can draw in the dust. I can, these are just examples. What does a branch look like? Now let's pretend, we always have them to act it out. Let's pretend that we are a very big tree. Point to the branches to tell where the branches are and what the branches are going to look like as they become trees. So research tells us, especially with ELLs, they benefit from vocabulary instruction that includes gestures, drama, acting it out. And these are moments, 10 seconds? 10 seconds to be a tree. 10 seconds to be a building, 10 seconds to be whatever it is that, a plant, whatever it is that you are teaching there. This is day 2. This is what this teacher was teaching on a day 2. So day 2, we focus on higher cognitive thinking. So what's the difference between a branch and soil? Would there be branches on a flower? Why or why not? It's time for the big kick question. See if you can figure it out. What would happen if we didn't have branches? What would happen if we didn't have branches?
Shade.
No shade.
There was shade in Vegas.
There would be no shade. You said there would be what?
There'd be no leaves.
There would be no leaves because the leaves come from the branch. Are there other things, other reasons, other things that you think about?
You couldn't climb the tree.
Couldn't climb it, couldn't play in the tree, okay? So again, these are contexts that require a lot of thinking by the teacher first before teaching it. Because you never know what children are gonna come up with. So you have, no, you don't.
No,
So
you
you have to brainstorm. Here's some examples because we taught this in Spanish too. So we had the visuals, the words written in Spanish. And Dr. Speeds wanted me to share that when we started this project, she was an assistant principal and we were at her school. And she worked with 2 teachers who were involved in our project. And she talked about ways in which these 2 teachers grew across the year because they were learning how to do these things here that I'm trying to teach you how to do in your own practice. So here was the word preview in Spanish that the teacher would introduce, same process, just different language. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to design a lesson. I'm going to focus on this. I've given you 2 books. One is A Nest Full of Eggs, and one is Ruby Flew 2. I want you to take one of those books. It doesn't matter which of them. And you're going to design, let's say, a day 2 lesson. Let me go back to an example of a day 2 lesson. Okay. So you've already read the book once, but now you want to focus on challenging, thinking, and challenging, talking. So I want you to design the lesson. What do you do before you read the book? Because you're going to read it again. What do you do while you read the book? This teacher stops twice. And what does she do when she stops? She points to what?
They're magic words.
The words that's in the book. She's looking at the illustration, the visual. That's the only time she stops to refer to the vocabulary, make a connection to the child's world, understand that they understand what they may not know about the term that she's reviewing. But you're going to come up with 2, let's do 1. See if you can do 1. 1 question, what's the difference between, first you have to pick what are the vocabulary words that you would teach? 2 or 3. Okay. You're going to develop a challenge question, which is what is the difference between a blank and a blank? You're going to develop a big kid question. The big quick kid question is always, what would happen if blank? What would happen if blank? Any questions? I'll repeat the instructions again. So you're developing a day 2 lesson. They've already read the book. You're going to read it again. So you have to figure out, what do you do before you read the book again? What do you do while you read the book? Your challenge questions are going to come after you read the book. You want 1 challenging question for 1 of your vocabulary words. That means you have to give them all a child-friendly definition. And then you want a big kid question. Melinda and Alicia, do you have any questions? And you can work on this together. You can work on it together with someone if you want, if you prefer to do it that way, that's fine. Samantha, do you have any questions? Heidi, do you have any questions?
Depends on.
Keep in mind that this is a science theme, and the science theme is nature. Things in nature need water, light, and food. I think that's how we defined it. So you're teaching something about nature.
In order to survive, then we need shelter.
Bless you. When we share out, I'll ask you what were the 3 vocabulary words you're going to teach.
Calling doesn't really tell you anything about it, just describes
And that's what I was thinking, that's what I went to first, was visual.
Think about word selection criteria. Should be depicted in the book visually.
It's a habitat.
Because she was temperature.
So animals fly away and they come back and have their nest because that's the cycle. And so mom was worried if she was gonna come back. Do you think, because she was weak, do you think she'll make it back home to continue the cycle? And then dad said she will over time. So that everyone like beyond grows and develops differently.
Beyond.
But they all do.
This one's
And
not
that's the
out
cycle.
their house.
Does that make sense? So, like, I focus more on beyond, because she's
And beyond, you got it, that's that. It's not kind of like how it has the picture, the visual, so like you follow the story here.
Or distance, or distance.
well, then you can relate beyond distance. And I don't.
Yeah, it's on the next page.
Oh, in the distance, into the distance.
And that's, yeah, the picture shows.
Yeah, and that's
So
good.
it is,
I can't hear you guys in the north as you're thinking. Unmute and just tell me what are you thinking in terms of words.
How would I teach?
Are you talking to us?
No, Heidi?
So that's one of them.
I'm looking at the word hatch.
That's what I think about, because that was my first initial.
I mean, I would do flight.
What's your theme, your topic that's related to nature? What do you think it would be? For us, we're teaching about birds. But it could be that you're focusing on something different. Melinda and Alicia, what are some of the, what are you focusing on? What's the topic?
The three words we selected were from the Ruby Flew 2. Hatch was one of ours. We decided lake was important to talk about, that some eggs are born next to a lake. And then it brings out some weather words because it's kind of confusing, driving rain and howling wind.
Okay, so everyone, let's talk about let's think first. What is the concept that you're teaching here? You start first with the concept. What concept are you teaching? What theme?
I would be working on living things and life cycles.
Okay, let's start with living things because life cycles could be a subtopic or not. So living things. So we're all focusing on living things, right? So then you might have a smaller topic like yours was the life cycle. Ours was birds. We had a whole unit on birds. Now, when I focus on the vocabulary, I'm developing lexical networks of knowledge. The words must be connected to the theme, and the words must be connected to each other. So some of you said hatch. I'll admit it, we taught hatch too. What other word would you focus on to help the child to understand the major concepts about whatever your theme is?
Feathers is very important to the concept.
Okay. You might teach feathers, yes. Who was talking? Yes.
I had a question real quick. So then, are you thinking that the magic words would be something completely different than perhaps some other vocabulary you might talk about to help with the comprehension of the story? The magic words are the ones that are
Your voice was fading. Did you hear me? Alicia, your voice was fading in and out, so I didn't hear you at the beginning.
Okay, can you, is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, so the magic words are they a bit different from perhaps other vocabulary words that you might need to address in the story to help with the comprehension of the story? Like the magic words are related to your concept or whatever you're teaching, but like when we were reading through Ruby Flew 2, there were some other things that we came across that might need to be discussed to the comprehension of the story.
Give me an example.
So whatever was the driving rain and the howling wind, because we're thinking, okay, so howling wind, kindergartners are going to think, or preschool, whatever, they're going to think, you know, ow, like a wolf or something howling, and so that might need to be, or the driving rain, and so those might need to be some things that were just might need to be at least be addressed in the reading and pointed out to the picture, because the illustrations illustrate those two very beautifully. But you might need to at least pause there. So we go to
that's discussed, but it's not going to be your major focus at all.
So what we're looking at here then, what you're wanting us to find is more of the vocabulary that would tie in with the overall concept and topic of what we're looking at.
Yes, so Alicia, those words that we chose also help them to understand the story, okay? So we wanted to get more bang for the buck. So we wanted to teach, we wanted words that would help them to understand the story, but also words that are connected to the concept. Things like howling and the other term that you had are kind of incidental. So if someone brings that up, we discuss it. But that's not our focus, because you can't, you can't teach everything.
Right.
You spend a little time discussing. I've never seen a child ask about the howling wind. What they focus on is when. They learned when probably 2 weeks before.
Okay.
But if you have a child who said, well, how could the wind howl? Then you address it and you move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
More like hatch, because it's all about the chick hatching and the time it takes for things to happen.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So we said our theme was like change, like everything changes over time. And we also included hatch, but maybe precious and beyond.
What changes? Let's think about your
animals,
words.
Animals.
Okay. Animals, good. Animals change over time.
But also people, so that they can connect it to their own lives.
But you're teaching about animals. You make the connection to people building background knowledge.
Okay, so animals specifically change. Birds or ducks change. First, they're precious and tiny like an egg, or they hatch from an egg. They're precious and tiny like the baby. And then as they grow, then they leave the nest and they move beyond.
So you're teaching the word nest?
No.
What's your other word?
Precious and beyond.
Okay. Is precious related to hatch?
Well.
No.
Okay, no.
You can use precious in your discussion, but you don't focus on precious.
What other word relates to hatch? Hatch is to break out.
But what is aren't you talking about change?
Yes.
Okay, that animals change.
Yes.
Birds change.
Yes.
They hatch. That's why I said, would you teach the word nest? Because when you change, you're going to leave the nest.
Okay.
Would you talk about time concepts, because it repeats over and over and over again that she will in her own time. The egg needs time to develop.
So the word time.
She needs time to develop, to be able to swim, to eat, to fly.
Do you think nest is that big of a word? Like I see it's like something you just touch on again because it's a picture of their home.
What other words do you have?
You could build with nest in your theme of going beyond, because you could have them be like, okay, animals change, but they come back to these areas for it. So maybe nest needs to be a word that is discussed because it's the place that they come back to.
I think the fact that we focus so much on tier 2 words, and now we're focusing on connected lexical networks is throwing
So tier
Right,
two,
thinking.
these are still tier 2 words. So we're trying to expose them to words that they may not learn in the environment, or maybe we're teaching them to use the words differently than what they may learn in the environment. But what we're also trying to do is not teach concepts in isolation. Teach it and move on. That's not what we want to do. So we want to make connections. But I'm going back to the book. I'm trying to remember what did we teach. I know we taught hatch.
Because also going on with like the thing of change, in this book, related to it, you could do feathers because it talks about them having like the baby feathers in here. And then
soft fuzz.
The soft fuzz, and then it talks about flight feathers and their
You could.
feathers grow.
Good point.
And so it could be one of those words that she talks about in this Ruby book. You know, it talks about eating things. Will she ever swim? Will she ever fly? Her feathers grew out and her wings
You
were
make a
broad and
good point
beautiful.
right there.
You know, you could relate those into your theme of beyond and change
go.
because they start out as these itty bitty fuzzy feathers and then they get their water repellent feathers and go on.
There you go. So you can make a case for feathers. You can make a case for nest, but you couldn't make a case for precious. Could use precious in my conversation, just talking, and just very informally. You know, precious means, you know, something that I hold dear in my heart. And you know, when we start off in life, our parents hold us dear in their lives. So there, I've taught precious, but that precious is not going to help them to learn about change and nature and birds and etc. So you're being really narrow in what you focus on. But that's a really good question. This is a great learning experience here. And I think we might have taught nest.
I had picked hatch, nest, and feathers for my vocabulary words.
I think for this book, usually books like this that have less content to teach from limited us. And if we were limited in our selection of words, we selected 2. Not ever less than 2. This approach that I'm going to share now, we developed it for 3rd graders and 4th graders, but you could use it in 2nd grade. 2nd graders are kind of at a pivotal point there because they've got some reading skills there. So with this program, we actually had funds to purchase chapter books. Yes, we did. I was the title chapter 1 coordinator at that time at a school, and so we actually purchased class sets of text. So when I worked as a curriculum developer for this study, then I brought that concept with me. We need to purchase class sets, and we gave the class sets to teachers to use. Okay, so let's talk about this approach. This approach, in terms of vocabulary development, really focuses on the awareness of morphemes in words. So I know that you've had the class here on, I don't even remember at this point what is taught. I know that Dr. Bengochea teaches it. So if someone could kindly remind us of what is a morpheme? We know that phonemes are the smallest units of sounds. What are morphemes?
Smallest piece of meaning.
There we go. Could you say it louder so we're all on the same page?
Smallest piece that represents meaning.
The smallest unit in a word that represents meaning. So if I've got the word, and you guys can't see it there, so I'm just writing cats. And I'm adding the S there. It's giving me the meaning that this is more than one. So I kind of give you some little information here about the English orthography, meaning the system of how the sounds work together in the written language. I said the English orthography or language system is based on phonemes, the smallest units of sound, and morphemes. Well, there was the definition right there, the smallest unit of meaning. As students learn to read, they must be taught to attend to both the phonemes, to decode words, but also to the morphemes, to understand the meanings of new words. So as children progress in their English language proficiency, they also also should progress in their morphological awareness, which is the ability to identify and to manipulate morphemes or units of meanings to form words. So this whole approach was published as, it was called the Vocabulary Enrichment Program Project, VEP. I think, Liz, I gave you copies that you wanted to look at, okay? This is the approach that's used for this program. Okay, and we focus on word parts, okay? This says that more than 60% of unfamiliar words encountered in text can be broken down into smaller word parts. And then knowledge of word parts such as prefixes, suffixes, roots, meaning Latin roots, Greek roots, can be used to increase children's ability to recognize related words and word families. So again, that's a type of network. Word families, okay, connected by word parts, so that their networks of knowledge and conceptual understandings are expanded. So now we're focusing on vocabulary, not teaching it as a whole word. This is roots, this is nest, this is hatch. But we're going to be looking at words and teaching children to be aware of word parts and how parts can contribute to the meaning of the word. So here's an example of a lesson. This is from the text. It's called Wright, Richard and the Library Card. Is anyone familiar with who Richard Wright was? Okay. Richard Wright, he was an African-American author. He talks about his growing up in Harlem and his experience in first going to a library and being exposed to books in the library. There are two African-American writers whose lives were transformed by going to libraries. Richard Wright was one. James Baldwin was the other one who had a similar experience. So this was a children's book about Richard Wright and the library card. Notice here, I'm using a 5-day scope and sequence. For some reason, 5 days seems to be sufficient time to do whatever it is that a teacher needs to do in terms of teaching concepts and accelerating vocabulary knowledge. So let's look at a routine. Day one is always previewing of the lesson. So they're reading the words, they say and write words. They read definitions and do something with those words at home. So now we're including writing around words for second grade, fourth, third, and fourth grade. So day one is always stable. Day two, review the vocabulary. We predict a storyline. The teacher reads the entire book, but the children are following along in their chapter book. Wasn't there someone who uploaded a video where everyone had a copy of a book? Yes, your children everyone had a copy of a book. Is there someone else? But there were two teachers where everyone had a copy of the text, because that's a luxury for every child to have a copy of the text. So the adult reads the book, and when she reads a magic word, then the children who are paying attention, they do a thumbs up. They indicate, this is a magic word. I hear it, I identify it, okay? Then they look at vocabulary as it's presented contextually and paraphrase sentences. Now, this approach was originally written for teachers who were teaching in Washington, D.C. and teaching in Houston, in areas where there were high populations of African-American children who spoke African-American vernacular. Because what we wanted to do in a morphosyntactic approach is to attend their attention to word parts and different places that would be deleted, or the sounds that would be deleted or omitted within that dialect. But this is an approach that can be used for English language learners because they are acquiring language proficiency also, but in a different way. So I wanted to point that out because day one, I don't think you'll see this on the slide, but just wanted to point that out. So day one is stable, day two is stable, day three is stable. I use the term stable because it doesn't ever change the type of activity. So day three, they're using context clues and reading words and trying to understand what they mean in the context of sentences. But what I like is day 4 and 5. Day 4 and 5 are enrichment kinds of activities. Day 4, you might focus on multiple meanings. There are a whole series of activities and strategies that might occur on a day 4 or a day 5. They're mostly games, but they're helping children to look at word parts. And so I want us to look at this particular lesson, and then there are many pages that I put in your binder that we'll look at. Okay, so this is day 2. We're predicting what the story is about for Richard Wright. So the teacher is using a semantic map, and the questions are to generate discussion. What were Richard's experiences in the library? How can a trip to the library change one's life? Why do people go to the library? So we're making connections between school and home and the world, okay? So the next page. This is so difficult to maneuver. Okay, we'll put this up here. There we go. Here's one activity, same and different. Which word doesn't fit? So this might occur on a day 4. Here are vocabulary words that have been taught. This was from another text. And so we asked them for each line. There is a word here that does not fit. What is the word and why? So let's look at number 1. We've got a hotel, boarding house, an inn, and lagoon. Which word doesn't fit? Lagoon. Why?
Hotel, boarding house, and inn are all where people pay to stay.
Okay, good. Look at number 2. Wealthy, prosperous, underprivileged, comfortable. Which word doesn't fit?
Underprivileged.
Why?
Because that means you don't have enough. It's the opposite.
Because the other words,
Well, you also can say the prefix un tells me not based on my word series. So if I'm not privileged, it means I do not have something, whereas wealthy and prosperous and comfortable means I have luxuries or amenities or things.
okay. Number 3, rebel, revolutionary, insurgent, follower. Which word doesn't fit? Follower, why?
The others are going against.
So there's a pattern in all of these interventions. We don't just ask these higher level questions, we always follow with what?
Structure.
Why? Why? We want them to explain their reasoning. We want them to use their language. That's very important. Think about that in your own practice. Why questions are very important and that are emphasized within the class observation system. They're under that category of concept development, okay? So always push children to asking them why. Let's do one more. We've got number 5, borrow, lend, loan, and give.
Give.
Borrow.
If you're lending or
Also,
giving, you're
if I
on
give
the line
it, it
of
doesn't come
giving
back.
it.
If I borrow it, it goes
Borrow
back. If I lend it, it goes back. If I loan it, it goes back. It's returned. If I give, it's not returned.
I see if you borrow, you're taking. If you lend, loan, or give, you're providing.
I see it with Terry.
But no, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying there's 2 different ways, and that's the whole point of justifying your answer. It's just like the standardized test. Just because I put a different answer doesn't mean I'm wrong. It doesn't mean you're wrong.
Samantha, what were you gonna say? Were you gonna say something? Someone was gonna say.
I think she was just trying to get locked back.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, you're correct. There are a couple of answers for this one, but this is another activity that lends itself to higher order thinking and higher order talking. Okay. Here's another one. These are riddles and it's called What Am I? These are detectives look for clues and sentences to help you choose the correct word. I may have put an example of this in your binder, so it'll look there. So I couldn't put everything here. Now, if I could read this, it says morphographic element. So we're looking here at the ending of shun, I-A-N. It says suffixes are word parts that can be added to the end of a word. And it gives examples, shun, I-A-N, I-O-N, one who, related to, okay. Then it gives some examples like an optician, a statistician, a beautician, and a mathematician. I think the word optician was part of their vocabulary. And so what you do is you look at the vocabulary that's present. It tells you what it is you can do with these words. It helps you to understand which word parts can you focus on. So optician has a suffix. So then we're going to broaden the child's understanding of what that suffix means by giving other examples there. Then it says sing our words in context. It gives sentences. The optician was careful to fit each client with carefully fitting contact lenses or eyeglasses. It uses the word in context. So these are other examples of expanding children's knowledge, but expanding it around word parts. Here's another example. I love this series. These are, I call them the Julian books. This one is called The Stories Julian Tells. Beck and McKeon calls this deep processing. This is another strategy that is in her book. So the name of this is from this chapter, The Pudding Like a Night in the Sea. And so we focus on these words, whipped, smooth, cracked, straight, smooth, booming, guard, even, crater, and the activities in the book. So let's look in our binder. There should be, yeah, there it is. It's personification. There are, let's see, how many activities here for us to look at? I think there are about 5 pages. Okay, so for example, in this text, we focus on personification and similes. So again, I'm not just deciding which of these strategies I'm going to focus on. It's all guided by what words can I find in the book itself. Okay, so I give a student tip about making comparisons. What's the definition for personification? What's the definition for a simile? And then we give them sentences and ask. Identify each of the following comparisons from the story as either personification, writing a P, or simile with an S. That's one example. Then in part B, it says, what does it mean? It says, choose the letter that best describes the idea that the author tries to communicate when she makes comparisons by using personification and similes. Use the underlined words to help you. And these are idiomatic expressions. Let's do one of them together. It says, when father laughs, this is what the narrator says in the book, the son laughs in the window panes.
Personification.
Okay, it says use the underlined words to help you. So does this mean A or B?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
For A. I would say A, Julian's father has a happy laugh.
It's happy, not sad. Why?
The sun laughs in the window panes would imply that everything is brightening up and smiling and laughing with him.
Laughing is happy. Let's do the next one. When father thinks, you can almost see his thoughts sitting on the tables and the chairs. Again, these are sentences lifted from the text itself. Okay, so we're using the text to teach multiple things. So which A or B would be the right way to interpret what that means? B? Everyone agree? Yes, and then the last one. It, meaning the pudding, will taste like he calls it, Julian, a whole raft of lemons.
Pudding will have a tart bitter taste.
Tart and bitter. So these are examples of, if you've noticed, all of these shared book reading interventions go beyond reading the book. You start with the book, you start with vocabulary, but then you have these short little activities that are connected to deepen word use and to deepen conceptual development. Shared book reading doesn't just revolve around just reading the book in these interventions, okay? So let's look at the next page. Well, these are personifications and similes also for week 2. Let's go into the next one. For week 3, this is the same book because it's split up by chapters. I think that was something I didn't explain. So for second graders with chapter books, you can select a chapter and the chapter can be the focus for the whole week. So if you have a book with 4 chapters, you've got 4 weeks of instruction there, okay? So you're not counting out how many words in a passage like we did for second grade. This is different, these are chapter books. So it says here week 3, so that's a different chapter. So now we're focusing on prefixes and suffixes like pre and on and it and li. And so the vocabulary word that appeared in this book was prehistoric. So that's why we decided to work on pre, and unusual was the other vocabulary word, so that's why we decided to work on un. And so there's some examples here of looking at the words in context. That's a discussion point. Then if you look at the next page, we continue with focusing on pre and on and ik and li, giving other examples, again, seeing words in context. Then we look again at the next example. These are called word cousins. I like these activities. It says, these words are related to each other. Read the word and think of its meaning. How does a prefix or suffix add to the meaning of the word? So a scientist is related to the word scientific, and you talk about why. A giant is related to the word gigantic, and you talk about why. Heat is related to preheat, and you talk about why. So these are really word expansion activities, but focusing on morphemes.